Hi, and welcome to the 12th installment of the Dad Project, the third of several I have planned about my dad's time in Vietnam. Glad to have you back, and tonight we will continue to follow my dad, Pete Purvis, as he and the Coral Sea are on the line at Yankee Station off the coast of North Vietnam as part of Operation Rolling Thunder. Here, he and his fellow airmen continue to bomb targets, protect those who are doing the bombing, take pictures of what they have done, all the while avoiding every variety of anti-aircraft weapon in the Soviet and Chinese arsenals being provided to the North Vietnamese. Let's get started by looking at Operation Rolling Thunder by the numbers, but first, let's hear Orson Welles recite John Gillespie's High Flight one more time.
Oh, I have slipped the surly bonds of earth and danced the skies on laughter's silvered wings. Sunward I've climbed and joined the tumbling mirth of sun-split clouds and done 100 things you have not dreamed of. Wheeled and soared and swung high in the sunlit silence. Hovering there, I've chased the shouting wind along and flung my eager craft through footless halls of air. Up the long, delirious, burning blue, I've topped the windswept heights with easy grace, where never lark or even eagle flew. And while with silent, lifting mind I've trod the high, untrespassed sanctity of space, put out my hand and touch the face of God.
Think what you will about statistics and the numbers and opinions that flow from them, but they can give an overview and better sense of the vastness of a human endeavor. For this story, it's numbers that outline the massive effort, fortune, and human expense that was exhausted to bring an agrarian third world country to its knees. Operation Rolling Thunder lasted from March 1965 to November 1968, and in that period the USAF, Navy, and Marine Corps flew 306,183 sorties over Vietnam. In an end-of-year reaction report for 1967 charting the progress of Operation Rolling Thunder, the Department of Defense reported that the U.S. had dropped 864,000 tons of ordnance on North Vietnam. That was well above the tonnage drop during the entire Korean War and more than the tonnage dropped in the Pacific Theater during World War II. And Operation Rolling Thunder would continue for nearly another year. One CIA report estimated that these airstrikes caused $500 million in total damage to the North. A staggering sum for such a small country, but this was a nation that had thwarted occupation by the Chinese, the French, and shifting borders and wars with its immediate neighbors, and was aware of its limitations and capabilities. Before Operation Rolling Thunder had even started, the North Vietnamese had begun to decentralize its population. By the end of 1967, half of Hanoi's population had been moved to the countryside. In that same time period, the northern economy had also been decentralized, with most of its industry being broken up and scattered to caves and small villages throughout the country. The existing infrastructure, particularly transportation, was neither complicated nor complex and was easily repaired. Numerous bridges were taken out during the air campaign and just as quickly repaired or replaced by dirt fords, ferries, or underwater pontoon bridges. The Vietnamese transportation system proved resilient and capable throughout the war. The United States would spend $900 million over the course of Operation Rolling Thunder. The North Vietnamese casualty count varies depending on what report you choose to believe. The CIA estimated that by April 1967 there had been 52,000 casualties, killed and wounded. Another put the total for the duration of the operation at 76,000 casualties, killed and wounded. And finally, one government report put civilian dead at 30,000 for the course of the operation, while another report put the civilian dead at 182,000 souls. Whomever you believe, the human cost for the North Vietnamese was not insignificant. Operation Rolling Thunder would claim 922 aircraft, Air Force, Marine, and Navy. Over the course of the entire war, the Navy would send 21 aircraft carriers on 86 war cruises to the line on the Gulf of Tonkin. In that period, the Navy lost 532 aircraft to combat, with 329 lost to other operational causes, resulting in the deaths of 401 pilots, with 64 pilots reported missing and 179 taken prisoner. The bulk of the dead, missing, and captured of these Navy pilots were lost during Operation Rolling Thunder. Now, American losses pale in comparison to the North Vietnamese, but what those losses fail to reveal is that each of those lost pilots had taken years to train, and for better or worse, combat experienced pilots were even harder to come by. As Operation Rolling Thunder progressed, replacing those lost pilots became more and more difficult. So it should come as no surprise that my father would be pulled from the ASW pipeline as pilot crew losses mounted in Operation Rolling Thunder. Repeat after me: the needs of the Navy. 99% of all statistics only tell 49% of the story, is a quote from Ron DeLegge's book, Gents with No Sense, and is apropos for our story. We've already given the cold numbers for the aircrew losses, the number of carriers sent to Vietnam, the number of sorties flown, and the number of aircraft lost. What those numbers don't disclose is the immense strain on men and equipment that resulted from Operation Rolling Thunder. The 21 carriers were comprised of more than a few small, aging Essex-class carriers that were close to retirement. The 3 Midway-class carriers were long in the tooth, while the new supercarriers were just coming online. The Essex-class carriers were too small to host the new Phantom. My dad's carrier, the Coral Sea, even in the best of conditions, could not launch a fully fueled Phantom with a full munitions load because of the limitations of its aging steam catapult. Additionally, carrier operations are extremely dangerous at any time. With continual operations with live ordnance in wartime conditions, those operations are even more precarious. In October of 1966, a flare was mishandled while being stored on the USS Oriskany. That resulted in a fire that cost the lives of 44 men, mostly aircrew. Later in July of 1967, a Zuni rocket misfired while aircraft were being prepared to launch on the USS Forrestal. That fire resulted in the death of 134 crew. The Coral Sea was not immune to these fires, but was far more fortunate when in October of 1967, a Zuni rocket ignited during a routine test in a forward assembly area. But the fire was quickly brought under control and the ship remained fully operational, launching strikes the next day. These fires not only killed men and damaged the boat, but they also required carriers that were scheduled to rotate back to the States to remain on station, with their exhausted crew, pilots, and aircraft in place of the damaged boats. Additionally, boats that were doing workups before arriving on the station were now arriving without completing those workups to replace these boats. Peacetime flying puts limitations on how you fly your aircraft. Certain maneuvers and G-loadings are prohibited. Engine management is a priority, and flight time is strictly regulated. All of this to extend the life of the aircraft for that wartime rainy day. As you can imagine, in Operation Rolling Thunder, every day was a rainy day. Most peacetime prohibitions were either suspended or ignored. In efforts to avoid SAMs, other aircraft, and objects, airframes were literally bent, and this on top of any war damage that may have been inflicted along the way. As the operation progressed, squadrons were finding it more difficult to keep a full complement of aircraft through their crews. Pilots weren't as difficult to replace, but as the operation progressed and more of the senior airmen retired or gave up their commissions or technically timed out of rotation, the replacements were becoming greener and greener. And whether the pilot was green or not, they flew an average of 20 days a month and sometimes 2 missions in a day. This was a rigorous, mind-numbing schedule. And the weather, oh the weather, affected operations in every way. The monsoon season curtailed flight operations constantly. When it wasn't raining, the haze from the humidity made target acquisition difficult, if not impossible. Low flying, which was either by design or to escape a bad situation, often resulted in the canopy fogging over. The heat and humidity also had a detrimental effect on equipment. The Army, that had a typical 8-year replacement cycle for equipment, was forced to replace equipment every 2 years in Vietnam. The effect on electronics and systems was horrendous. Hoses and wires were corroding and deteriorating so quickly that until it was better understood, systems were unusable. Condition 1 and Condition 3 pilots tended to sit in a pool of sweat, awaiting the possibility of a launch. Humidity was ever present. It was just a question of whether it would be at 90% or at 100% on any given day. Of the hundreds of thousands of sorties flown over Vietnam, my dad would be responsible for 99 of them, from July 1967 to September of 1968. He would accumulate close to 420 hours of flight time in the F-4A and B, and 230.9 of those hours would be in combat. He would make 116 day traps and 23 night traps in the Phantom. Through divine intervention, a lucky rabbit's foot, incredible flying skills, or a more fatalist view, it wasn't his day to die. Only one of the Phantoms he flew over Vietnam was hit, and then only by a small piece of shrapnel. But like our review of the numbers for Operation Rolling Thunder, this only tells part of the story. Let's flesh out our story with a tale of two of those missions. The details of this mission come from an article my dad wrote for Flight Journal's December 2005 issue called Night Flight, a hazardous trip over Hanoi. When two carriers patrolled the Gulf together, they would be on a 12 hours on, 12 hours off rotation, as the Coral Sea and the Kitty Hawk were doing on this particular day. The carrier that was on the down cycle would have two ready alert fighters, Condition 1s, manned and readied at the waist and port catapults, and would be in the air in 5 minutes should a threat be detected. Additionally, there would be two Condition 3 aircraft that would be manned aft of the island. They were to be in the air in 15 minutes. These aircraft were there should either of the Condition 1 aircraft have problems and/or additional aircraft were required for the threat. My dad and his Rio, Lieutenant J.G. Barry Cooper, had just set foot on the flight deck for their midnight to 4 a.m. shift in the Condition 3 aircraft when the loudspeaker ordered the launch of the Condition 1 aircraft. As they continued to their F-4, the loudspeakers broke in again to announce that one of the Condition 1 F-4s was down and to launch the Condition 3 aircraft. My dad and Coop drew the short straw. They scrambled into their plane. These ready alert fighters were there to fend off torpedo boats or MIGs. To cover both bases, the planes were loaded with Zuni rocket pod, 3 Mark 24 flares for the boats, and 2 Sparrows and 4 Sidewinders should the threat be a MiG. On this night, it was MiG-21 making feints toward the carriers. Having launched, my dad was given vectors for the MiG and for the Condition 1 fighter from VF-161 that had launched earlier so they could form up and continue the chase. The radar on VF-161's F-4 wasn't working, so my dad and Coop took the lead. They soon were atop the monsoon clouds at 15,000 feet and with new vectors went to 35,000 feet and passed Mach 1 to begin closing on their target. As they closed to within 20 miles, my dad pushed the throttles forward to close faster but seemed stuck at Mach 1.25. He quickly realized that he had not jettisoned his empty centerline tank, the Zuni rocket pod, and the flares, and the jet was well past its safe jettison speed. Just as quickly, what had been a closure rate soon became a separation rate, and if they continued to follow, they would be dragged over the heart of Hanoi and its brutal air defense system. It was a trap, and if it had not been for the drag-inducing weapons load, they probably would have gone through the trap. After they broke off their pursuit, the adventure continued, however, as they couldn't land on the Coral Sea or the Kitty Hawk as both decks were fouled. They vectored to Da Nang, but it was below minimums to land, so they were vectored one more time to Chu Lai. Once there, they were hot-racked in a bunk vacated by Marines on patrol. Having left the Coral Sea at midnight, they finally left Chu Lai the following day at noon and back to the Coral Sea at 2 p.m. Another day in paradise. The details of this second mission come from an article my dad wrote for Flight Journal's April 2003 issue called Flak. On October 27, 1967, my dad and his Rio, Lieutenant J.G. Barry Cooper, would strap into a Phantom that had begun life as an F-4H-1, Buno number 151448. It had been part of VMFA 531 that would be the first land-based Marine Corps squadron in Vietnam in 1965, flying out of Da Nang in support of Marine ground forces, before being transferred to VF-151. 151448 would end its career having been upgraded to an F-4N, transferred back to the Marines as a member of VMFA 112, when it was ditched in the Gulf of Mexico on August 29, 1977. Having been briefed on the strike in the cramped strike operations room, my dad's F-4, radio call sign Switchbox 110, would be loaded with 2 750-pound cluster bombs in anticipation of its flak suppression duties on this day's Alpha Strike. They would be flying in support of the A-4s from VF-155 off the Coral Sea and F-8s and A-4s from the Oriskany, as they laid down mines in the Kim Quan Ferry crossing 2 miles south of Hanoi. Following the flak suppression run, they would then provide MiG cover. In the words of Helmut von Moltke, one of the many German war strategists, no battle plan survives contact with the enemy, or, as my father wrote, the fog of war blanketed these well-laid plans. So, with their 45 pounds of flight gear strapped to their bodies, they then strapped into their F-4 with knee boards loaded with notes and numbers for the day's mission and stroked off the bow of the carrier, their concentration tamping down their fear. The closer they got to Hanoi, the more concentrated and deadly the anti-aircraft fire became. Various chirps and clicks sounded in their headsets denoting different types of radar. Concerning, but with 30 miles left for Hanoi, the SAM tracking tones began to merge with the rest, and the pucker level went up considerably. As the SAMs launched to greet them, the formations began to maneuver wildly, jinking left and right and steadily down. The F-4s could make up the speed and altitude, but the A-4s couldn't, so it was a wild treetop ride all the way into the target. This was not according to plan. They were still on target, but by this time the North Vietnamese had a reasonable idea of where they were headed. The North Vietnamese were aware of Navy and Air Force tactics, and that worked in my father's favor. The Vietnamese knew the first plane in was a Flak suppressor, so they hunkered down and kept their heads low and let my dad do his thing. Then as quickly as they could, they manned their guns and awaited the bombers, in this case the A-4s. The Coral Sea's aircraft made it through with no losses, although the A-4s were well shot up, but nothing serious and all made it back to the boat. The Oriskany squadrons were second in and were shot up badly. Their radio chatter, like a ball game, is heard by the Coral Sea's planes as they ducked and dodged, bobbed and weaved their way to the coast and to safety. The typical SAM calls and emergency frequencies are then disturbed by every pilot's fear. 2 of the A-4s had been shot down. The good news was the sight of 2 chutes. First guy is landing in a lake in the middle of town, says another pilot. Both are captured, one is beaten badly, and they spend the rest of their war in the infamous Hanoi Hilton. This was the strike my dad had written to his parents about with no detail, enough to say that he went 3 miles south of Hanoi and that he didn't care for that a bit. The pilot who landed in the lake and was badly beaten was John McCain. He had barely survived the fire on the Forrestal, but his luck had run out. So until next time, when we continue with my dad's big adventure and take a closer look at the home front, with my mom, my brother, my sister, and myself, as well as the wonder that is North Korea, thanks for joining me for the 12th installment of the Dad Project. I continue to tell the stories I had hoped my father would tell me, and I appreciate y'all being along for the journey, so please subscribe if you'd like to hear more, and until next time, thanks for watching, and enjoy what life has given you. Ciao.